Hey, this is Andy Rivers with Beyond 20.
And this is Brian Flora, also from Beyond. This is Brian Flora from Kentucky Fried Chicken. I just followed Andy home. He's such a valuable customer then.
I just found him on the street, and honestly, I don't know what he's doing. Today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about CAB meetings. So for most of us that are doing change management, this is a weekly meeting that we have to talk about the changes, evaluate the risk. And in just about every organization, this is one of the most expensive meetings that you have on a regular basis. So one of the things we wanted to talk about was how to run an effective CAB meeting. So one of the things to first talk about is the things that should be on the agenda. So for an agenda for a good CAB meeting should be, we want to review our normal changes. So those are the changes that are coming up that we should be talking about. You also want to talk about any emergency changes that happened since your last CAB meeting. So you're not going to go back and unapprove them or undo them, but you still want to have sight, you still want to have visibility on those changes that occurred. So everyone in the CAB is aware of that change.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that sometimes, even if you have an emergency change advisory board or an ECAB that actually approves those emergency changes, then you still might, you're still going to have your regular change advisory board or CAB do a review of those completed emergency changes. And part of the reason you're doing that is because, on an emergency change, you're not really oftentimes going to take as much time before the change to, get all your documentation in order and so forth, because you might be dealing with an emergency situation, system down, that kind of thing. But the part of what this review does is allow you to have a kind of set of checks and balances to make sure that you go back and get that documentation in place afterwards.
Right. And a big part of the CAB is obviously the authorization, but it's also the communication around it. And so if you had an emergency change that happened over here, you got to kind of come back and close the loop so everybody knows what happened, why it happened, and just to kind of keep the CAB on the same page.
And what can we do to keep that from happening again? How can we keep that same emergency from happening over and over again?
Yeah. It's also a great control mechanism to help you with your change management so that poor planning doesn't become emergency. So poor planning should not institute an emergency change, although that happens sometimes. And it's a lot harder if you have to come back to the CAB the next week and be like, yeah, this was an emergency because the CAB meets on Tuesday and I had to do it on Saturday, and I realized on Thursday I hadn't submitted my RFC. And then suddenly it's an emergency because of my poor planning. It's a lot harder to sit in a CAB and explain that. So.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about a lot in my ITIL Foundation classes is that, for a lot of the organizations that we work with, what we encourage people to do is to put a policy in place that says every time you institute an emergency change, then the following week you have a meeting with the CIO to explain why that was an emergency. To justify your emergency change. And if it was, hey, we got a new virus definition, we didn't want to go into the weekend exposed, then, that's quick and easy. But if it's the scenario you described where, hey, I forgot to put my RFC in again, then,
Nobody wants to go to the CIO and be like, yeah, that upgrade we've known about for the last 3 months, I just didn't submit my RFC on time. So that's the sort of things that should not be an emergency.
Right.
So normal changes, emergency changes, the changes that were implemented since the last CAB, so you sort of close the loop again. You're not going to do a full post-implementation review on these, but you are going to come back and sort of say, okay, was it successful? Was it not? Was there issues? Again, that idea of closing the loop. You came to this group, you came to this body and asked for authorization to do it. So you kind of want to let them know how it went.
Right. So going through our agenda, to kind of bring this back together, first we're going through a review of completed changes, and so that's both emergency and normal changes that happen. What happens next on our agenda typically?
So the next one is also if you have any standards up for approval. So those become standards. So standards are those things that they're going to become pre-authorized. That's part of being pre-authorized, so you can do them, within the scheduled, within the parameters of what that changes. Within the standard, So the standard changes. But you have to come back and approve those as a standard. So you review those again as part of your CAB.
Right. Okay. So, and then after that, you're sort of going through the the list of what changes are on the docket for the upcoming week or for the upcoming period, whether you start, approving things or evaluating things at 1 week out or sometimes, further than that, depending on the nature of the change. So who should attend a CAB meeting?
So that's a good question. So CAB meetings, you need to have representation across your IT organization. If you read the ITIL publications, letter of best practice says you can have customers in there. I'm personally not a fan of it. I feel like that's a little bit too much of the customers getting to see how the sausage is actually made. And I also feel like when a customer's in the room, we don't have some of those hard conversations that we need to have in the CAB. So in the CAB, we need to sort of pull it apart and say, hey, are we doing it technically the right way? In IT, there's, dozens, hundreds of ways we could do a particular issue. Are we doing it the right way? We need to have that conversation in the CAB. And if your customer's in the room, a lot of times you're hesitant to have that conversation.
Yeah, I also feel like that's not always respectful of customers' time as well. So, on a CAB meeting, if I'm building a CAB or putting that in place, I share that opinion that I tend to say that if I'm the change manager and you're coming to my CAB meeting, if there's a customer approval that we need, I generally would expect that you've gone out and gotten that approval from the customer in advance before coming to the CAB, whether it's approval for a schedule or approval for downtime. While we're on the topic, I would say that financial approvals, I generally feel the same way. That sometimes you'll see people put financial management on the CAB, but I kind of think that if you haven't gotten the approval to spend the money or to allocate the resources, then there's not much point in coming to the CAB. So I like to treat that as sort of a separate approval step.
Right. Yeah. And without the customers there, I sort of view that's the role of the business relationship manager. That's who they should be there, representing the customers, representing their interest, and also being a communication tool back to those customers, letting them know what's coming up and those sorts of things coming out of IT. So you get customer representation without the customers actually having to physically be present in your meeting.
Yeah. Now that goes back to the topic of who should be on the CAB. The one thing that I think is really important is who chairs the CAB, and that is always the change manager. Right. Whoever your change management process owner is should be the chairperson of your CAB, right? Because it gets back to this idea of single points of accountability. That ultimately, when you talk about doing approvals, you really want the single point of accountability. So the change manager is ultimately accountable for it, and the CAB is literally an advisory body.
Yep. The other one you kind of want to think about is highly recommend that the CIO is not that person.
Agreed.
Because what happens is I've been in these CAB meetings where if you have a CIO there, your CAB meeting sort of goes, you evaluate the change, and then everybody looks at the CIO to see if are they going to give the thumbs up or thumbs down, and then everybody votes the same way as the CIO.
Yeah.
The other thing that does is you want some level of exception, some level of approval outside the CAB in case you have to override it. So maybe there's some risk to it that says, there's a 70% chance of, a failure within this. The CAB decides, hey, 70% is too great. We're not going to do it. Your CIO may come along and go, hey, this is business critical. You're telling me there's a 30% chance of success.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. I appreciate it. I know the CAB evaluated it, but we are doing this change anyway. And if they're part of the CAB, it sort of violates the way it's supposed to be doing that. So you kind of keep that authorization outside of CAB so you can escalate to it when needed.
Yeah, the CAB is really a tactical decision-making body who should really be able to look at a change on its merits and say, is this something that is this a sound approach? Is this something that we can viably do within this window at this time and manage with these other schedules? If you have people that are too high up in your org chart on your CAB, then you end up having a lot of decisions made at more of a portfolio management level. So who else goes on your CAB? Well, that's where it gets a little bit more of a gray area, I suppose. You will typically, feel free to disagree on most of the CABs I've been a part of or with customers I've worked with. You tend to have between 3 and 5 permanent CAB members, but the makeup of any given change advisory board meeting will kind of change based on what's on the docket for that particular week. So, your change manager is the chairperson of your CAB. I think there's a solid argument for whoever is the owner of your CMDB, your configuration manager. If that's someone different than the change manager, then that person you probably want to be in the CAB. A lot of organizations will have somebody from information security management as a permanent CAB member. Who else do you see as permanent cab members?
I'm a huge fan of having whoever's over your service desk on
Yep.
the cab, because they are your front line. They're going to be ones filling the brunt, and they're the ones that are going to be saying, hey, you're talking about going live with us on Friday. We have zero documentation, zero support, so we're going to have to escalate all calls to Tier 2, Tier 3 because we don't know how to support it. They're also the ones that can help you with your communication to say, hey, you're sending this announcement out. What you wrote is all IT jargon. Our users aren't going to understand that. So they're really another way to sort of get your customers represented and also help you support it while it's operational. So I kind of feel like they need to be on there.
Yeah, and you kind of bring up an interesting point there that, when we see cabs fail, a lot of times it's because you have people on the cab that are not willing to reject a change, that aren't willing to say no. Your change advisory board shouldn't just be a rubber stamp. You have to have people that are willing to say no, there's no test plan here. No, this looks too risky. No, this isn't the right time to do it. Because, at the end of the day, a lot of most organizations have a change advisory board or some kind of change management process in place now. But, in order to determine if you're effective, I always say you kind of have to look at the metrics, right? Is your change management process, reducing the number of failed changes? Is it allowing you to get changes successfully done more quickly? Is it reducing the cost of changes if that's something you're tracking?
Yeah, and the number of incidents caused by a change.
Yep.
That's a good one to let you know. And that one helps you sort of with the denying the changes too, because like you said, a lot of times people are really hesitant to reject that change, but if you go to the cab and we sit around and we approve a change that the rollback plan or remediation plan says undo change, shame on us as a cab. That never should have gone through because you violated the whole purpose of doing it. You essentially wasted the person's time filling it out and our time reviewing it because they really didn't put any of the content in there to help us avoid the problems and the challenges that change management helps us with.
If your cab is just a black hole where changes go to die, then people will go around the process.
Yep. They either go to die or they're rubber stamped no matter what.
Right.
And that sort of brings in, so we sort of talked about, the agenda, we talked about the cab members. The other thing that you really want to establish is what is the conversation and decisions we're trying to make in the cab. And what you'll see is that a lot of times two decisions need to be made. One of them is, are we doing the technically correct approach? Is this the technical way to do this? Is the best way to carry out this plan, this change? The other one is the actual authorization around the timing, the scheduling, those types of things. And what you'll see sometimes is the cab sort of floats between those two discussions. And if you've ever been in one, the sort of symptoms of that is, let's say a DBA comes in and says, I want to make this change. And somebody in the room just picks apart their script, like, how did you do this? Why did you do that? And, that person leaves going, man, they don't trust me. They don't know. Meanwhile, the next person that comes in, it's a network engineer and says, hey, I'm going to do this switch upgrade. It's going to put this firmware version. Everybody's like, oh, okay, that's good. You just had two totally different types of conversations because you didn't establish, hey, when is this technical review going to happen? Is it happening in the cab or is it happening before it gets to the cab? And that also helps you decide who your cab members need to be.
Right. You might even have vendors on your cab. I've seen folks, maybe not on a permanent basis, but if you're doing that, network upgrade that you were talking about, and you've got somebody from your network, switch provider that's going to send professional services to assist with it, then they might attend the cab meeting, that week to sort of advocate for the change and explain how it's been tested and all the other places it's been done and answer questions and so forth. So that's not uncommon as well.
Yeah.
So.
And again, I think like you hit on, you have some standing members on your cab, then you have people that float in depending on the type of change, and those people that float in can be vendors, especially if they're the ones doing the change or providing sort of the subject matter expertise within that.
Yep.
But so I think that gives people a few tips. So
yeah, absolutely.
Sort of the agenda, the cab members, the conversation.
So if you have other questions, just feel free to comment in the video below or shoot us an email, and be sure to subscribe to our channel.